Thank you for joining me. It's Nicole from Dogo Argentino, USA. Today we're going to talk about yeast infections in Dogo Argentinos and ways that you can manage this common and unfortunate problem. We're going to discuss what a dog yeast infection is, what the symptoms of a yeast infection in your Dogo is, some home remedies that you can do, and to just try to help you get a handle on this unfortunate and common problem. So yeast-based dermatitis is very common in Dogo Argentino dogs, and it's super frustrating and unfortunately is probably the number one most common skin irritation outside of parasitic infestation like fleas. But don't worry, we're going to talk about some different things that you can do to help solve this problem of itchy, red, rusty skin, and we're going to look at some of the important parts of addressing yeast infections in Dogo Argentinos. So first of all, you're going to want to know, what is a yeast infection and how do I know if my Dogo Argentino has one? So yeast is a microscopic fungus and it lives in your Dogo Argentino's intestines, and it's actually part of their healthy gut bacteria environment as long as it's in controlled numbers. So it's normal to be part of your dog's digestive tract. It's a normal part of their life. And yeast actually does do something beneficial for the Dogo. It helps them digest certain types of food. But when yeast overgrows and explodes in number, the population can cause your Dogo Argentino to suffer, and we call this a fungal infection or a yeast infection. And there's two species of yeast that are a terrible problem for your dog. One is Candida albicans, and the other people are less familiar with, that's your Malassezia. So yeast is normally pretty much has its numbers controlled by the friendly bacteria that's in your dog's gut. When your dog's gut is out of balance, it can allow Candida albicans to explode. And this yeast grows out of control and it starts to irritate the cells that line the dog's intestine. And this cell wall normally has really, really tight junctions that stop viruses and bacteria and yeast from entering the bloodstream from the intestines. But when the yeast grows out of control and causes lots of inflammation, these spaces actually widen, and that yeast begins to leak in a leaky gut syndrome out of the intestine, and it can get into the bloodstream, and then it's actually entering the skin from inside of the dog, not outside of the dog. And so if you've got those problems, you're going to have yeast issues. And so bear in mind that yeast isn't always something that's introduced from the outside in, but often from the inside out. So what are some symptoms of yeast infections in Dogo Argentino dogs? One of the key signs is that you're going to have an allergic reaction. And that allergic reaction can be based on the fact that they are experiencing leaky gut from the inside out. And yeast likes a very specific pH. And you can actually do pH tests if you're a scientist and determine that that's the issue. Obviously, at home, you're not going to do that. So these are the common signs you're going to look for at home. Chewing or licking the feet in between the toes. Dark, rusty red towards brown hair in between the toes specifically, but also the ears. It can be on the muzzle. It can be around the butt. If you have like really, really bad smell, it literally smells like fresh bread. Head shaking, ear infections. You can sometimes see hair loss where they've just chewed on the tail or the upper back. They can have that rusty color around their genitals or sometimes a grayish color. And these things are all signs of yeast infection. And it's super important to recognize what you're looking at, because the longer you wait to treat a yeast infection, the longer it goes untreated, the harder it is to get rid of. And once your dog has one or more of these signs, it's time to treat that yeast. And there's a couple different things you can do to try to control the overgrowth of yeast. And there are some things that you can manage at home with yeast infections, but they require lifestyle changes. So the number one thing you want to look at is, what are you feeding your Dogo Argentino? Is the easiest way to control yeast infections. And one of the most common problems that people have is they are feeding it low quality kibble. And this is going to cause that dog to have an overgrowth of yeast, because one of the things that yeast loves is starch and the other is sugar. And if you are feeding a diet that's high in starch and high in sugar, you can easily lead to the overgrowth of yeast. And another thing that yeast loves is heavy metals. And heavy metals can get into low quality food, but it's also present in other things like vaccines. So to a certain degree, you should vaccinate your dog and you can't avoid those. But the yeast and the sugar, you definitely can. When you have so much of this starch and sugar, yeast grows out of control because there aren't enough good bacteria in the gut to compete with the yeast, because it has a high amount of food that it enjoys. And also, if your gut bacteria, the good gut bacteria, is getting knocked back because you've used antibiotics recently, you're going to get a yeast overgrowth. When a yeast cell doesn't have to compete with other organisms, i.e. the good gut bacteria, it's going to become a super yeast. And it changes from that single cellular structure to a more complex multicellular fungus. The more this happens, you're going to get more and more things that it's going to eat around it. And this aggressive yeast can release over 60 different types of toxins. And it's terrible. So definitely avoid starch and sugar. So starch and sugar is not really a problem, generally speaking, in a raw diet. So if you're feeding kibble, you're more prone to yeast infections than if you're feeding a complete raw diet or a whole prey diet. So you don't want to give your dogs things that are going to cause them a problem, and you want to avoid foods that have high amounts of starch and sugars. That would be things with rice, millet, potatoes, sweet potatoes, wheat, corn, oats, peas. These are all simple sugars, and they just absolutely feed yeast. And heavy metals, those are going to be your things like zinc and iron, chromium, arsenic, cadmium, lead, mercury. Those are all toxic things in large amounts. And basically, you can't avoid vaccinations, which they all have heavy metals in them, but pesticides have a lot of heavy metals. And so you want to be very careful when you're treating your yard to avoid pesticides. If you have contaminated water, that's something to think about. Fish is a huge source of heavy metals, particularly farm-raised fish. And unfortunately, pet foods are often contaminated with heavy metals. And you want to make sure that you are trying to limit everything you can, with the exception of vaccines. Heavy metals are really, really toxic to the good gut bacteria, and they also can cause that leaky gut syndrome. So you want to avoid feeding fish and low-quality fish oils. If you can go organic when you're doing kibble, you would like to. If you can go with food that's produced in the United States rather than China, if you can avoid fluorinated water, that's going to help. Now, something I wanted to tell you about yeast infections that people kind of don't take into account. A lot of times they'll make changes, and they're great changes, but they stop too soon because it causes a die-off of the overgrowth of yeast. And then as these yeast start to die, they're going to release toxins. And those toxins basically are going to be very, very rough on the dog. And they can cause like a flu-like syndrome, nausea, joint pain. They can actually cause diarrhea. They can worsen the symptoms of the yeast infection. You'll see discharge from the eyes, nose, skin, and ears, joint soreness. And the number one way to avoid this is to give digestive enzymes. They can help quickly eliminate those dead yeast cells. And you can also bind heavy metals with humic or fulvic acid, bentonite clay. You can give chlorella. Those are going to help bind heavy metals or toxins. So one of the things that you can do to make yeast vulnerable to what you're doing is to basically destroy the biofilm. And the biofilm is like the protective layer that keeps the thing on the inside happy and healthy. And it's mainly a protein and fat and fiber layer. And digestive enzymes can break down all three of those. So you definitely want to give something like cellulase, which is a plant-based digestive enzyme, and that's going to help. So you want to give your digestive enzymes before you feed the dog, because when the dog eats the dog food, you're trying to make sure that it's protected in case there's anything in the dog food that's, feeding the yeast in the first place. So what do you want to do when you know you have a yeast infection? You can add antifungal foods and supplements to your dog's diet, such as caprylic acid or medium chain triglyceride, MCT. And MCT is found in things like coconut oil and palm oil, but you want to make sure that it's very, very high quality. Lauric acid is great because it helps address the cause of leaky gut, and MCT oil is a better source of caprylic acid than coconut oil is. You just want to make sure you're giving a very, very small amount. Caprylic acid is found in a variety of things. It basically causes the cellular membrane to break down. You can feed olive leaf to a large dog, maybe a teaspoon a day, and that's going to be very, very helpful. You can also give golden seal if you're giving a tincture, maybe 5 to 10 drops per 20 pounds, and those are some yeast killers that can be very helpful. So you want to crowd out the yeast, basically, and feeding a raw diet is the best way to do that. And you're going to have a much better result in your animal than by feeding kibble. And yes, I realize not everybody can afford to feed raw, but when you're looking at the Dogo Argentino breed, you have to consider that this is a dog that is unfortunately prone to yeast infections and skin problems in general. I personally think if you can't afford to feed raw, that maybe this isn't the breed for you just because the allergies are so common. Now, I've been very blessed that my dogs don't really suffer tremendously from allergies, and you do want to ask your breeder if they have allergy problems. Now, just because a particular line doesn't have allergy problems in the Dogo Argentinos, the parents of the litter, doesn't mean that they can't pop up in the future. Allergy problems are often, or being prone to allergies can be genetic. It can be environmental as well, but it can be genetic, and they sometimes skip generations. You can have whole groups of dogs that are fine and then have a generation that particular gene population has those kinds of problems. If you're giving your dog antibiotics, the chances of causing a yeast infection are quite high. If your dog has exposure to toxins through drugs or chemicals, flea and tick preventatives, cleaning products, those can be where they're getting some heavy metals and it's destroying the beneficial gut bacteria that would normally keep yeast intact. If you're giving cortisone medications, if they're on thyroid medications, if they're under tremendous stress, if they are not in a clean diet or a good living environment, those can be things that knock back the friendly bacteria. You can always add probiotics to the diet, and there's a variety of probiotics that are really, really good for yeast infections. You want to avoid things that yeast are present in or fermented foods. So any kind of breads or grains, yogurt, kefir, which are fermented foods. Only add in your probiotics and your prebiotics before your dog eats. Things like dandelion root, burdock root, chlorella, low sugar berries like raspberries. Those fiber-based things can reduce the heavy metals in the brain and in the body. Chlorella, which is a green algae, they love the taste of chlorella. I can actually give them pills of chlorella, and they really like that. Energy Bits is the brand of chlorella that I like. So these are just some things that can help you along. I hope you found this helpful. As always, please like, comment, share, subscribe to help the channel out. And I hope that you guys have a Dogo-tastic day. I know it's been a long time since I've made a educational long-form video, so I hope you enjoy this. Let me know in the comments below. Thanks. Ciao.